They told him to stand tall. The wind on the Eastern Front sliced through his uniform like it had teeth. But he didn't flinch. German soldiers weren't supposed to shiver. They weren't supposed to show fear. They were the tip of the spear of a new Europe. That's what the posters said. That's what the officers shouted. That's what he had built his whole life upon. But that morning, a small envelope slipped into his hands, sealed with an eagle, and it shattered everything. The message inside wasn't long, just a single line stamped by a bureaucrat in Berlin. Your mother is no longer a citizen of the Reich. And beneath it, in colder ink, Jewish classification enacted. His vision blurred. The snow, the trenches, the distant roar of artillery, all of it vanished into a ringing silence. His mother? A Jew? No. The Nazis must be wrong. They had to be. His mother sang German lullabies. She hung the flag every holiday. She prayed in a church. They had photographs of his father in the uniform of the Kaiser's army. But the papers didn't care about memories. The Reich didn't care about his heart. He folded the letter slowly, as if the careful creases could rewrite what was written. He tucked it into his pocket, right over his beating heart. Too fast, too loud. A sergeant stomped past, barking orders. The assault would begin soon. The Soviets were just across a frozen river, bayonets gleaming like icicles. He swallowed hard. He had a rifle in his hands, a German rifle, a good German soldier's rifle. But what was he now? Part of him wanted to run into the snow until his lungs collapsed. Another part wanted to tear off the insignia from his collar and scream that he didn't belong here. But those thoughts were suicide. The Third Reich didn't forgive confusion, or doubt, or blood that wasn't pure. So he clenched the weapon tighter. A good soldier fights for his nation, but what if the nation declares that soldier an enemy? He took one last breath and stepped forward into the sound of guns, fighting for a country that, at that very moment, decided he should not exist. What he didn't know yet was this: the deeper he fought for Germany, the closer he came to the truth that would destroy him. Before the war, his world smelled like fresh bread and sounded like piano lessons on Sunday mornings. He grew up in a quiet German town where neighbors waved from windows and children played football in the street until the church bells called them home. His mother would smooth back his hair and say, "You must always be a good German boy." And he believed her, because he felt German down to the marrow. He collected toy tanks, recited patriotic poems by heart, and dreamed of becoming an officer one day. At school, he raised his hand the highest when the teacher asked who loved the fatherland. Nobody ever questioned his loyalty, except sometimes he noticed the way his mother hid certain letters in a wooden drawer, the way she hesitated when people asked about her family, the way her eyes dimmed when the radio praised racial purity. He once caught her clutching a silver necklace, engraved with a six-pointed star. She quickly tucked it into her shirt, smiling too wide. "Just a piece of the past," she whispered. He didn't understand. Not then. Years passed. When Hitler rose, patriotic fever swept through every classroom. History books were rewritten. Children pointed out undesirables. Flags multiplied on every street. He wanted to belong, desperately. So when recruiters came, promising glory and brotherhood, he volunteered first. His mother hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. Her tears soaked his uniform before he ever saw a battlefield. "Come back alive," she begged. At camp, the officers measured skulls and traced bloodlines. He held his breath as they studied his papers, but nothing was found. He was welcomed, praised, told he looked like the future of Germany. That praise became his armor. He told himself that serving perfectly would erase any shadow of doubt, that loyalty could rewrite heritage, that medals could override ancestry, but war has a way of stripping away lies, one bullet, one order, one revelation at a time. And the truth he tried to bury was already clawing its way back to the surface. What he didn't know yet, the past always finds the soldiers who try hardest to outrun it. They shaved his head on the first day. The clumps of hair fell like pieces of his past. A drill instructor barked insults so close that flecks of spit hit his cheek. Every sentence ended with "Sieg Heil." Every mistake earned a fist to the ribs. Every soldier shouted the same vow. Blood and honor. He shouted too. Not too loud, not too soft. Just enough to blend into the sea of voices. At night, he lay on a straw mattress, staring at the ceiling, trying to memorize the rules of survival. Stand straight. Eyes forward. Don't hesitate when they ask you to hate. The swastika flags hung everywhere. Blood-red reminders of the new faith. It wasn't a religion built on forgiveness. It demanded obedience and purity was measured in blood. One morning the recruits were lined up before a towering banner. An SS officer with cold porcelain eyes inspected them like livestock. When he stopped in front of him, the air froze. The officer studied his face, then nodded slowly. Excellent bone structure, a true Aryan warrior. The men around him smirked with envy. Inside, his stomach clenched into a knot so tight it hurt. A true Aryan? If they only knew. He forced out a proud smile. That was the role. That was the mask. He had practiced it his whole life. They trained with grenades, carbines, bayonets. Bodies were molded into weapons, thoughts so hammered into loyalty. The instructor said Jews were parasites, criminals, weak. He stayed silent, his jaw locked so hard his teeth ached. Each cheer, each oath, each lesson was a blade, cutting him away from who he really was. But what choice did he have? Serve flawlessly, or be found out. He lined up again, right hand raised, swearing to protect a Führer who would kill him if the truth surfaced. The ceremony ended with applause and marching boots. A new German soldier was born. But under the polished steel helmet and the eagle on his chest, a secret trembled. Soon, even the loudest shouts of loyalty wouldn't drown out the truth inside him. The Eastern Front did not forgive mistakes. His division was thrown into frozen hell, snow up to their knees, rifles jamming from the cold, Russian artillery turning forests into splinters. Hunger gnawed at them harder than any enemy. Every morning, someone didn't wake up. But he did. Again and again. He learned to move unseen, to shoot before thinking, to crawl through frozen mud like a ghost. His commanders noticed. They liked soldiers who survived, especially soldiers who killed without hesitation. One night, they ambushed a Soviet convoy. The firefight was fast, brutal. When the smoke cleared, he realized his squad was alive because of him. He had taken down the machine gun nest alone. The next day, beneath a sky that looked like hammered steel, the captain pinned a silver medal to his coat. The men cheered. He saluted sharply. "You are the pride of the fatherland," the captain said. "Pure German blood in your veins." The words hit harder than any artillery blast. Blood. Always blood. He felt the medal's weight, a cold circle of lies pressed against his heart. If they knew the truth, that same captain would gladly put a bullet through his skull and pin the award on someone else. That night, by a dim lantern, he traced the medal with his thumb. The edges were sharp, too sharp, like a shackle disguised as honor. Some soldiers celebrated by drinking. He couldn't stomach a drop. Instead, he reached into the lining of his helmet and pulled out the photograph of his mother. Her kind smile looked back at him, unchanged by the madness of the world. He whispered so quietly that even the wind couldn't hear, "I'm doing this to survive. I'm doing this for you." But medals don't protect secrets. They expose them, and the more a hero shines, the more the shadows underneath begin to move. There were eyes watching him now, curious, suspicious, and one pair in particular was getting closer. The field hospital smelled of disinfectant and fear. After weeks of fighting, they marched the survivors in for mandatory medical evaluations. Most men groaned about the cold stethoscopes. He feared something else entirely: paperwork. He sat on a metal bench, boots dripping melted snow. A doctor in a crisp white coat approached with a clipboard and a stare that peeled away every layer of pretense. Name, birthplace, family background. Each question was a needle. He answered quickly, rehearsed lines polished over years. But the doctor wasn't satisfied. He studied his eyes, his skin tone, the shape of his face, measuring him like a specimen. Then came the question that made his mouth dry. "Any Jewish blood in your family?" For a moment the world narrowed to that clipboard. His lungs forgot how to breathe. One wrong twitch, one misplaced pause. Death. He forced a laugh, light, casual. "None, sir. We are loyal Germans." The doctor's gaze lingered, heavy with doubt. Then pen scratched paper. Stampa hit the form. Approval granted. He stood, trying not to collapse. As he left, a medic rolled a covered gurney past him. A pale arm slipped out from beneath the sheet. Fingers curled lifelessly, a faint triangle of ink still visible on the wrist. A prisoner, a Jew, someone like him. The room tilted. He pushed through the doors into the freezing air, choking on the truth. One answer saved him. One answer killed someone else. Back in the barracks, a comrade joked about the inspection. "They're making sure no rats hide among us." Men laughed. He didn't. He lay awake, staring into the dark, the doctor's question echoing through the silence. He realized something cruel. The Reich didn't need to prove guilt. Suspicion alone was a death sentence, and now that an officer had found a detail, others would follow that scent. Because once the hunt begins, secrets are prey. He avoided the barracks whenever he could. Too many questions lived there, too many curious eyes. Instead, he sat alone near the edge of camp, where the frozen ground met the blackened trunks of a forest, bombed to charcoal. His hands shook as he unbuckled his helmet and flipped it over. There, beneath the leather liner, taped flat to the cold steel, was the only truth he had left. A small photograph of his mother. Her smile was soft, almost shy, her hair pinned back the way she wore it before the war swallowed their town. That picture was his heartbeat, his reminder, his shame. He traced her face with a dirt-stained finger. "Forgive me," he whispered, "for what I'm becoming." A gust of wind carried distant shouts. Soldiers mocking Jewish prisoners. The hatred was constant, casual, thoughtless, and every word was a knife he had to swallow. He pressed the photo back into its hiding place. The liner snapped into position, sealing her away again. A secret held inches from gunmetal. Bootsteps crunched behind him. He stiffened. A young soldier, blonde, loud, too naive to suspect anything, dropped beside him with a grin. "You're always alone. You should celebrate. Heroes drink. Heroes boast." He forced a smile. "I prefer quiet." The soldier laughed. "You're strange, you know that. Almost like you're afraid of your own shadow." His pulse spiked. Shadows. Secrets. Mother. He shrugged it off and excused himself, walking away fast. But halfway to the barracks, he spun around, checking, making sure no one had touched his helmet. Still there, still intact. But paranoia had taken root. Every sound felt like suspicion. Every laugh felt like an accusation. Every salute felt like a lie. He slipped beneath his blanket that night, clutching the helmet to his chest like a lifeline. One secret photo stood between life and execution, and as he drifted into uneasy sleep, a thought sliced through what was left of his peace. What happens when a secret wants to be seen? The order came at dusk. Clear the village. Another nameless cluster of wooden houses swallowed by snow. But when they marched closer, he saw it. The unmistakable shape of a synagogue, half-burned, Star of David charred into its doors. The kind of place he wasn't supposed to remember. The kind of place his grandmother once whispered about in secret. Civilians scattered. Shots cracked through the twilight. Flames rose as soldiers torched barns and storerooms. He moved through the chaos with rifle raised, breathing through a knot in his throat. Then he saw them. A family huddled behind a collapsed wall. A mother clutching a boy whose dark hair and sharp cheekbones mirrored his own childhood. The boy's eyes locked onto his, eyes that asked, "Why are you pointing that gun at me?" His finger froze on the trigger. A soldier behind him snarled, "Fire, they're Jews." The word hit him like a slap. Jews, not enemies, not combatants, just people who shared blood he was forced to deny. He fired, into the air. The shot echoed like betrayal. The family scrambled into the shadows. Snow swallowed their footprints. The soldier cursed and rushed past, eager to chase them down. He stayed rooted in place, heart hammering against ribs that felt suddenly too small. Smoke burned his eyes. Or maybe that was guilt. He knelt, hands trembling, a rifle slipping from his grasp. Every prayer he learned in church seemed hollow now. Every patriotic speech sounded like poison. How many times had he imagined shooting the enemy? But what if the enemy looked like him? Behind him, the captain yelled his name. He straightened instantly, mask back on, emotions locked away where truth couldn't reach them. But the damage was done. That moment in the ruined village. He shot his reflection, and the Reich would eventually notice the hesitation in his trigger. Heroes don't hesitate. Spies do. Snowflakes melted on the ink before it dried. He sat behind the barracks, hunched over a scrap of paper torn from a Soviet propaganda leaflet. It was the only thing he could find to write on. His handwriting shook, forming words he'd never dared speak aloud. "Mother, I'm still alive, but I don't know who I am anymore." He wrote about the boy in the ruined village, about the metal that felt like gilt, polished silver, about the way every insult against Jews now felt like a dagger, with his name engraved on the blade. He confessed that every night he touched her photograph beneath his helmet, hoping it would remind him why he was still breathing. A gust of wind caught the letter. He grabbed it before it flew away. Would it even reach her? Did she still live in the same house? Did she live at all? A soldier stumbled out from the barracks, dripping with beer, laughing at nothing. "You writing love letters, hero," he slurred. "No," he muttered, folding the page quickly. "Ah," the soldier winked smugly. "Secret business. Don't worry, I won't tell the SS." He forced a grin, but his chest tightened. SS. Those letters were a shadow that followed him everywhere. When the drunk staggered away, he looked at what he'd written. The words stared back at him like a confession waiting to be discovered. One slip, one curious hand finding this paper, and he'd vanish into a camp with barbed wire and chimneys. His throat tightened as he tore the letter into tiny pieces. They scattered into the black snow like lost prayers. He pressed his palms to his eyes until he saw sparks of light. He wanted to scream until his lungs bled, but the night would swallow his voice before anyone heard. He slid the photograph back into place and whispered, "I'll survive long enough to tell you myself." But a promise made in war is a fragile thing, easily broken by the next bullet or by the next man who asks too many questions. And someone was already asking. He noticed the officer before the officer noticed him, tall, immaculate uniform, black leather gloves polished to a mirror, the kind of man whose silence was more dangerous than a firing squad, an SS intelligence officer sent to inspect morale and loyalty. He walked through the camp like a wolf counting sheep. When their eyes finally met, it was over something small, a fraction of a second too slow in shouting, "Heil Hitler!" Barely noticeable, but the SS noticed everything. The officer stepped closer, voice soft, too soft. "You don't shout like the others. You don't cheer. Why?" He swallowed, careful with every breath. "I save my strength for the battlefield." A thin smile curved on the officer's lips, a smile without warmth, without acceptance. "Or perhaps you save it for something else." The officer's fingers tapped a folder tucked beneath his arm. A single paper slid out slightly, showing part of a family registry stamp. His family registry. Blood turned to ice. "You were born near Frankfurt," the officer continued, tone still light, almost friendly. "Interesting town. Many questionable families there." He forced a laugh. "I believe in Germany." "That is enough." "No," the officer whispered, leaning closer. "For some of us, belief is not enough. We need certainty, purity." He walked away without another word, leaving a silence that suffocated more than accusations ever could. That night in the barracks, every creak of the floorboards sounded like SS boots. Every knock on the door felt like death clearing its throat. He stared at his comrades, laughing, drinking, sleeping, unaware that a predator had entered their world. He lay awake, helmet under his arm, fingers pressed against the hidden photo like a pulse check. One question haunted him. What happens when the man hunting you doesn't need evidence to kill you? Outside, the officer's shadow passed beneath the window. Slow, patient, a hunter with time on his side. It happened during a prisoner transfer. A line of emaciated men stumbled through the snow, striped uniforms clinging to their bones. They were headed east, to dig trenches no one expected them to survive. Guards barked orders, dogs snarled. He stood watch, rifle slung over his shoulder, breath frosting the air. Then one prisoner looked up, not just looked, recognized. The man stared as if he'd seen a ghost wrapped in a German uniform. A trembling voice slipped from cracked lips. "Is that you?" His heart detonated in his chest. He didn't know the man's name, but the man knew his family, knew his truth. The prisoner took a step closer, hope flickering like a dying match. "We were neighbors. Frankfurt. Your mother." "Silence," an SS guard snapped, cracking the prisoner's back with a rifle butt. He turned away, jaw clenched so tight, his teeth ached. But the prisoner wasn't done. Through blood and snow, he whispered again, barely audible. "You are one of us. Him. One of them." The words cut deeper than any wound. He grabbed the prisoner by the collar, not to hurt him, but to stop him from speaking. Eyes locked. A silent plea passed between them. "Please, don't save me. Save yourself." That instant became a choice. He shoved the prisoner roughly back into line, shouting for him to move faster. playing the part of a cruel guard so convincingly that the SS officer watching nodded with approval. But when night came, he snuck out. He found the prisoner shivering behind a supply shed, dying slow. He pressed a chunk of bread into the man's hand, voice shaking. "You must forget my face, forget my name. If you don't, they'll kill us both." The prisoner's eyes glistened, gratitude buried under terror. He slipped back into the darkness, but the panic followed. If a starving prisoner recognized him, others might too. Identity was no longer a secret. It was a battlefield, and he was losing ground. Rumors move faster than bullets. Within days, whispers slithered through the camp like cold fog. Men paused when he passed, glancing just a second too long. Conversation stopped the moment he entered a room. Something had shifted, and he didn't need a spyglass to know where the suspicion started. The SS officer. One morning, as frost glazed the jeeps and rifles, the officer summoned him. A tent, a desk, a single lamp casting long shadows. He saluted, stiff, precise, but sweat trickled down his spine beneath the wool uniform. The officer didn't speak at first. He simply opened a folder. Inside were documents he recognized, but shouldn't have seen in anyone else's hands. His father's death notice, a census form, a school listing, a birth certificate corner, the torn part that once held a religious designation, all pinned to a page with one silent accusation, a tiny, red, hand-drawn star, not stamped, not official, personal. The officer looked up slowly, savoring the tension. "You are an excellent soldier," he said. "Brave, efficient. But bravery does not excuse impurities." He forced a neutral expression. "My loyalty is unquestionable." "Oh?" The officer leaned back. "Then why do you hesitate when Jews are mentioned? Why do you look away? Why do you show mercy?" That word hit like a firing squad. His pulse thundered. He had to fight to keep his voice even. "I'm a soldier," he answered, "not a butcher." The officer's eyes sharpened. In this war, they are the same. Silence fell so thick, he could hear his heart scraping against his ribs. Then, with a casual flick, the officer closed the folder. "Be careful, Gefreiter. Your blood may betray you." A pause, a smile that wasn't human, and "I am very patient." Dismissed. He stepped out into the freezing air, but the cold couldn't numb what he felt. Fear had a name now. It wore black gloves, and it held his future in a folder. The hunt was no longer quiet. It had begun. He expected chains. Instead, they handed him a train ticket. The summons came from high command. Report to Berlin. Immediate. His comrades clapped his back, thinking he'd done something heroic. The SS officer simply watched with that same predatory calm. Like a man who already knew the punchline to a joke no one else understood. The train crawled through the winter-strangled countryside, smoke trailing like a funeral veil. A guard escorted him into a building so polished and quiet that it felt like another world, a world far from trenches and frozen corpses. Paperwork, bloodline analysis, questions wrapped in velvet threats. He answered everything with the discipline of a man fighting for one more breath. Then the verdict came. A general, medals heavy as grave markers, slid a document across the desk. At the top, stamped in bold ink, Deutschblutigkeitserklärung, a German blood certificate, signed by Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring himself. He stared at the paper as if it might bite him. "This recognizes you," the general said, "as an Ehrenarier, an honorary Aryan. Your service has proven your loyalty to the Führer." Honorary. Aryan. The words tasted like rust. "That officer in your regiment," the general added with a knowing smirk, "had concerns, but your bravery outweighs your questionable heritage." The Führer needs soldiers like you. A medal earns amnesty. A bullet dodged, for now. He tried to thank them. The words crawled out of his mouth like wounded insects. As he left the room, he realized what had actually happened. The regime had not cleared his blood. They had claimed it. His identity wasn't saved. It was confiscated. Outside, Berlin hummed with electric lights and victorious posters. A nation celebrating a future they were exterminating others to build. He pressed his back to a stone wall, lungs shaking, gripping the certificate until his fingernails bent. He was safe, but only as long as he was useful. A soldier with 2 bloodlines, and now 2 masters. And the SS officer back at the front wasn't done with him, not even close. They didn't send him back to the front line immediately. First, they took his picture. A camera flash burst like artillery in a small studio in Berlin. Behind him, a painted backdrop of rolling fields and perfect skies, Germany, as the Reich wanted the world to see it. He stood in a pressed uniform, boots polished, metal gleaming. A photographer adjusted his chin with cold fingers. "Look proud," the man instructed. "Oh, you are proof." Proof of what? Hours later, he saw the poster. A true German hero, his name printed in bold. His face, sharpened and idealized, stared back at him from a wall. But they didn't use his real biography. Instead, they wrote a story where his family roots were ancient German oak, where his loyalty was born from pure blood and sacred duty, where nothing, absolutely nothing, hinted at the truth they had buried. He felt nausea rise in his throat. Crowds of civilians stared at the poster, admiring him as the kind of Aryan youth the Reich needed. Some pointed and whispered admiration. A boy saluted. A mother smiled with pride. He wanted to rip the paper down, scream the truth into their faces, tell them that lies kill, quietly, efficiently. Instead, he saluted back and walked on. Every step felt like betrayal. Later, a propaganda officer shook his hand, praising his bravery, speaking loudly so others heard. "We'll send copies to every front. Your face will remind the troops what they fight for." What they fight for? A lie printed in ink and posted on every wall. When he returned to the front, soldiers cheered him like a celebrity. They clinked tin cups against his medal. They called him our perfect German. His helmet felt heavier now, not from steel, but from the photograph taped inside it. 2 truths pressed together, suffocating him. The face the world worshipped, and the face he saw when he closed his eyes. The SS officer watched from a distance, arms crossed, smile thin as a razor. A hero admired by millions is a scandal waiting to be uncovered. The Reich had turned him into a symbol. Symbols are glorified or destroyed. The war was collapsing like a dying star. What once felt unstoppable, tank columns, marching songs, endless speeches, now cracked beneath the weight of reality. Germany was losing. Cities burned. Supplies vanished. Desperation seeped into every order. His unit was thrown into one final push near the Oder River, a hopeless attempt to stop the Soviet flood from drowning Berlin. The air stank of gunpowder and frozen bodies. Artillery flashes painted the night blood orange. He fought harder than ever, not for victory, for survival. Bullets snapped past his ears like wasps. A comrade screamed for his mother before silence swallowed him whole. The metal on his chest was scratched now, smeared with mud and fear. As explosions shook the earth, he ducked into a crater and realized he was shaking, not from the cold, but from the weight of a truth he couldn't outrun. He wasn't dying for Germany. He was dying for the lie that Germany printed about him. A flare illuminated the battlefield, and for a moment He saw his own reflection in a sheet of ice, a German helmet, a Jewish face, enemy and patriot sharing one skull, a contradiction wrapped in a uniform. A fellow soldier crawled up beside him, gasping, "We fight for the Führer until the last breath." He turned his head, staring, searching the man's eyes for conviction. He found only fear dressed in fanaticism. He answered nothing. Above them, Soviet tanks roared closer, treads grinding the frozen earth into broken bones. Officers screamed useless commands. Someone tried to rally a charge, the kind of suicidal bravery Hitler demanded. He didn't move. He kept his gaze fixed to the ground, where his boots slowly disappeared beneath settling ash. He whispered into the deafening chaos, "This isn't my war anymore." In that instant, the poster boy hero Germany adored finally died. But the man inside the uniform, the boy from Frankfurt, was still alive. Barely. He could still choose who he would be, if he lived long enough to choose. Berlin fell with a groan that sounded like a dying animal. The Reichstag was a skeleton of smoke and shattered stone. Flames licked the night sky, lighting up the ruins like a macabre celebration. Somewhere in the distance, a loudspeaker still tried to broadcast orders from ghosts. The Führer was dead. His empire followed. Civilians fled with suitcases of memories. Panthers and tigers lay twisted and broken on roads clogged with fear. The proud soldiers of yesterday were now only silhouettes, lost, trembling, trying not to look at what they had done. He found a small courtyard behind a collapsed building, hidden from the chaos. He dropped to his knees, legs too weak to hold the weight of everything he had carried for too long. His helmet hit the ground first, then his rifle, then slowly, his hands reached for the uniform that had been both shield and shackle. The fabric was stiff with dried blood, some not his. The metal still clung stubbornly to the chest, glinting like the eyes of the dead. He tore them off, 1, 2, 3. Each one hit the cobblestones with a clink that sounded like a verdict. He struck a match. The flame danced nervously at first, like it understood the gravity of what it was about to consume. He held it to the wool, and the fire spread, eating the eagle insignia first. The swastika curled into black ash. Smoke wrapped around him, stinging his eyes until tears finally broke free. Not for Germany, not for defeat, but for the years he had spent killing a part of himself to survive a lie. A woman passing by stared, horrified. "You're burning your uniform?" she asked. He nodded once, voice too raw to use. "I won't wear their hatred anymore." She made the sign of the cross and hurried on. He watched all of every thread burn away until only buttons and warped metal remained, a smoldering pile of past sins. He stood there naked under the coat he'd stolen from a dead civilian, shivering, from cold, from fear, from the sudden freedom that terrified him more than bullets ever did. He was no longer a German soldier, but he wasn't sure he was anything at all. The war had taken his country. Now the truth would take his peace. He didn't run far. There was nowhere left to run. Soviet patrols prowled the outskirts of Berlin like wolves tearing apart a carcass. He raised his hands the moment they spotted him. A thin figure in a civilian coat, too big for his frame, boots caked in ash. They shoved him down, kicked his ribs, called him fascist dog. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He had worn the uniform they hated. That was enough. Days bled into weeks inside a makeshift detention camp. Barbed wire, mud, hunger, a familiar hell, but this time on the losing side. His fellow prisoners clung to their ideology like dying men clutching crosses. "We will rise again." One hissed through cracked lips. "The Führer lives through us." He turned away, nauseated. He had no Führer left in him. One afternoon, an American officer examined paperwork, scavenged from Berlin, stamped with a swastika and lies. The officer shoved a finger in his chest. "So, you're a Nazi?" His voice scraped out, hoarse and trembling. "No." The officer squinted. "What are you then?" It was a simple question, but he had never been allowed to answer it. Not in training, not in war, not while wearing that uniform. He looked up with eyes stripped bare of bravery. "I'm Jewish." The officer blinked, confusion wrinkling his forehead. Laughter burst from nearby guards. Bitter, disbelieving, cruel. "A Nazi Jew?" They jeered. "That's a new one." He said nothing more. Words were useless here. The truth sounded like a joke after so many lies. But inside him, something steadied. For the first time in years, he had spoken his identity out loud, not whispered over postcards, not hidden under a helmet, not denied for survival. He had said it and survived the moment after. The officer tossed the papers aside with a grunt. "We'll figure out what to do with you later." He was escorted away, shackles clinking like punctuation. He'd been a hero, then a fraud, then an exception. Now, finally, he was just himself. No propaganda, no medals, no masks, and that was the most terrifying freedom of all. The Americans didn't know what to make of him. A Jewish German soldier. That was a contradiction too absurd for paperwork. So they locked him in a separate enclosure. Not with SS loyalists, not with Nazi officers. Alone. A man with no category. Too Jewish for the Germans. Too German for the Jews. Every night the barbed wire around him cast thin shadows across the dirt, like the bars of a cage that didn't know what animal it was holding. He listened to the other prisoners talk. They blamed traitors, cowardice, the weather, anything but the ideology that devoured them. They still clung to Hitler like a ghost they prayed would return. He had no ghost left to pray to. One evening a guard tossed him a radio. "Entertainment," the man said sarcastically. He almost pushed it away. Then he heard the broadcast, a journalist describing Buchenwald, a survivor recounting forced labor, numbers so large they were no longer numbers. 6 million. 6 million. He froze, breath trapped in his chest like a scream that didn't know how to escape. His mother's face flashed in his mind, the softness of her laugh, the way she always hesitated before hanging the flag, the necklace she hid, a small six-pointed star. He had once believed she was safe. The Reich protected patriotic families, he told himself. They wouldn't hurt a woman who raised a good German soldier, but the Reich didn't care about her loyalty. It cared about her blood. He pressed his forehead to the chain-link fence, metal cold against skin. The radio kept talking. Every word was a hammer smashing what remained of his denial. All that killing, all that cheering, all those posters calling him a perfect German. He wasn't a symbol. He was camouflage, a useful lie the Reich kept alive long enough to hide their truth. His hands clenched until his fingernails dug into his palms. He had served the executioners of his own people. He had killed wearing their uniform, and somewhere in the ashes of Europe, his mother might lie nameless among millions. A sob broke free, quiet, jagged, painful. They wanted him to be a hero. He was just a survivor crawling out of the ruins of his own delusion. The war was over, but the guilt had just begun. He learned quickly that truth meant nothing here. Every morning, American officers questioned the prisoners, sorting believers from monsters, victims from executioners. They asked the same question in different ways. What did you know? What did you see? What did you do? Most responded with outrage. We were soldiers. We followed orders. We didn't know about camps. But when they asked him, he said nothing. Silence was the only honest answer, because he had known enough. He had seen enough. He had fired enough bullets to bury the truth under snow and denial. The Americans expected him to speak, to explain himself, to become evidence against the very regime that nearly destroyed him. But every time his mouth opened, guilt grabbed his tongue like a fist. One officer slammed a report on the table. "You're Jewish. Why didn't you escape? Why didn't you resist? Why didn't you turn on them?" His voice finally cracked free. Fragile, frayed. "You don't understand. When everyone around you believes a lie, the lie becomes the only place to breathe." The officer scoffed. "That's not an excuse." He agreed. It wasn't. Later in the yard, a group of prisoners taunted him. "Nazi Jew, traitor to the fatherland. At least we chose a side." He stepped away, but they followed, desperate to blame someone weaker than themselves. A fist struck his jaw. Another blow. Boots kicked his ribs until he tasted iron in his mouth. The guards broke it up, but the damage was done. He curled in a corner that night, hands over his ears, trying to block out the relentless accusation pounding inside his skull. He had betrayed his mother by wearing that uniform. He had betrayed his comrades by hiding who he was. He had betrayed himself by surviving. A man with no loyalty left to cling to. A soldier without a cause. A Jew without a family. A human without forgiveness. The moonlight crawled across the dirt floor, outlining his shaking form. In that harsh silver glow, he understood his punishment. He wasn't imprisoned by walls. He was imprisoned by memory. Survival was not a victory. It was a sentence. And the trial, the real one, had only just begun. Hope is a cruel thing. It doesn't die when you expect it to. It lingers. Small enough to hide, strong enough to hurt. He wrote her name on every scrap of paper he could find. He begged every chaplain, every Red Cross nurse, every officer who would spare him a glance. "Please, can you help me find my mother?" They checked registries, transport lists, camp records, cities wiped from maps. Weeks passed, then months. One morning, an orderly approached his bunk with an envelope, his own handwriting staring back at him like a ghost returning home. Stamped in heavy black ink, "Undeliverable, unknown, likely deceased." His knees buckled. The ground rushed up. The air disappeared. Everything inside him broke at once. He had survived the war. She hadn't survived the world he fought for. He found himself outside, gripping the fence so hard, the rust cut into his palms. Tiny wounds, nothing compared to the one tearing open inside his chest. A chaplain approached gently. "There's still a chance." He shook his head violently. "No, there isn't." His voice sounded hollow, as if spoken by someone else. He remembered the day he left for war, her trembling hands straightening his collar, her last whispered plea. Come back alive. What she didn't say, because perhaps she knew, was why she was crying. She didn't fear losing a son. She feared losing him to the people who would kill her. He slid down the fence until he sat in the dirt. The returned letter crumpled in his fist, his breath stuttering in sharp, painful bursts. Some prisoners watched quietly. Others turned away. But he wasn't looking at them. He was staring at a future that no longer had her in it. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't a son anymore. He wasn't sure he was human anymore. Grief wrapped around him like barbed wire, tight, unrelenting, cutting deeper the more he struggled. A guard muttered under his breath, not unkind. War doesn't end when the guns stop. He didn't answer, because he had finally learned the darkest truth. When the killing ends, the morning begins. Some nights, he still sat awake, waiting to wake up, as if this, all of it, were a nightmare in the wrong uniform. But morning always came, and he was still alive. The Americans transferred him to a new camp, cleaner and quieter. They gave him books, decent meals, time to rehabilitate. Rehabilitation, a word that tasted like pity. One day a rabbi visited, sent to counsel displaced Jews. The rabbi approached gently, seating himself across the table. "I was told you are one of us," he said kindly. He flinched. One of us. He hadn't heard those words in years. The rabbi smiled softly. "I know it's hard, but you are welcome among your people." He stared at his hands, the same hands that fired into a village of terrified faces, the same hands that tore a medal from his chest too late. "I'm not welcome anywhere," he whispered. The rabbi leaned forward. "You survived impossible circumstances. That is a miracle." "It's not a miracle," he snapped, anger bursting like a wound split open. "It's shame. It's cowardice. It's serving the devil and calling it duty." The rabbi's expression didn't change. He had heard confessions darker than this, and darker still. "You were a boy trapped between bullets and lies," he said. "That is not a sin. That is a theft of innocence." The words should have comforted him. They didn't, because comfort felt like oxygen in a room without walls, momentary, insufficient, cruelly temporary. Some nights, he dreamt he was back on the Eastern Front, snow melting into blood as his mother called to him from somewhere he could never reach. Other nights, he dreamt of the boy he spared, the one who had mirrored him with terrified eyes. If that boy lived, did that mean redemption lived too? He didn't know. He wasn't sure he wanted to. One evening, staring at the sunset over the camp's quiet fields, he whispered into the fading light, "I don't believe in nations anymore." A pause, a breath, and "I don't believe in gods who stay silent." His voice cracked, "But I might, someday, believe in people again." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't hope. Just the faintest possibility of a future that didn't taste like ash. He had stopped being a soldier, but he had finally started being a man. He wasn't repatriated quickly, paperwork lost, files mislabeled. A man without a category shuffled from one office to another like a question no one wanted to answer. Years passed. He finally returned to Frankfurt, the place he once believed defined him. But the streets felt smaller, houses felt older, and his mother's home was gone. The neighbors had new names he didn't recognize. A bakery he once visited had been replaced by silence. He stood in the empty lot where the house used to be and tried to picture the sound of her laughter in a space that held nothing now but weeds. A stray cat brushed against his leg. He whispered to it as if it were listening, "She wanted me to come back alive." He did come back, but he wished he hadn't made that promise. He found a burial registry, one line, a number instead of a name, no grave to visit, no stone to place flowers on. So he carried a small pebble from the site in his coat pocket, a Jewish tradition for a grave you'll never find, a symbol of memory preserved when the world tries to erase it. Years later, he visited a cemetery at dawn, mist hanging low like uncried grief. He walked row after row of uniform headstones, iron crosses marking soldiers who died for a lie. He stopped at an unmarked grave and placed the stone there, not because he knew the man buried beneath it, but because he knew what it meant to have no memorial, to exist in the footnotes of tragedy, to survive and still be forgotten. He whispered. We were all lied to. His voice didn't tremble. It was too tired to tremble. He stood there long after the sun rose, until light revealed the quiet truth of the world he now lived in. Nations rise, propaganda fades, uniforms burn. But the people who live through history carry what history refuses to hold. He walked away slowly, not as a hero, not as a victim, but as a witness. And witnesses, when they speak, can reshape how the future remembers the past. Just before leaving the cemetery gate, he looked back once more. If your grandfather had seen me then, what would he have said? A breath, a long, quiet breath. Maybe that I'm still here. And if a story like this made you feel something, if it changed how you look at the uniforms in those old black and white photos, share it with someone who still remembers, so the forgotten can finally be seen.